Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay, fine. So I know that you've all been eating and resting, and I know you might sleep, but this session is actually good if you sleep because I'm trying to make you dream of a better future. So don't worry if you fall asleep. I hope not. But. So a bit of my background. I guess some people give me the credit that I coined the term Devops. So by starting the first conference in 2009 in Belgium, and from there a lot of things got started, got a chapter in the Web Operations book, DevOps for Developers now out, and I'm working on the DevOps cookbook. I'm actually a freelancer, currently working for Qatar Consortium and Atlassian On Demand. But you find me on Twitter. No strings attached. I don't do one vendor or whatever. So the story of today, how many people are actual developer here? Majority. Any sysadmins here? One? Okay, that's cool. Yay. So we're almost there. Agile. If you're a developer, you're probably familiar. Agile brought like the business and the developer kind of together. And at the same time, something like the cloud was bringing the operational people and the users together. So in that perspective, what happened in the conversions of time is that like dev and ops, there was some overlap, but the pressure was actually coming from this. The business had the idea, projects was delivering, product went to the ops, and then the users brought in the money. So what's the actual problem was that this, from ID to ka-ching, had a little hiccup here in the middle. So that's what we're trying to address. I'm going to talk about areas. You can think of an area as a synonym, often as a phase your company will go through if they start thinking DevOps. I'm not saying you have to do it one by one. You can do it all at the same time, but I'm rephrasing it as areas that need attention while you're ramping up a DevOps initiative in your company. So I told you that I was going to hammer on sharing and sharing in DevOps. The most important thing is that when you start DevOps is they start to have a shared view on reality. It's not just you producing code as a developer or the ops people getting something live, keeping something up. It's the fact that we're trying to drive the business to the users. And once you start seeing that as a whole, you start optimizing the different parts differently. Because in the past, it was way too often that this was getting locally optimized. How can I push out more code, more features, more stuff? And this part was about like, hey, I want to have stability. Nothing else goes through. We're blocking. So if you're rethinking that, my new view of the thing is, I want to have like a feature when I go live to user and it doesn't stop somewhere here, that changes your mind. It doesn't stop you checking your code somewhere in the middle and then somebody else taking responsibility. Does that sound familiar? In companies, very often, there's this big barrier somewhere in the middle. What helps is actually, if you start on a DevOps kind of journey, is that you start with value stream mapping. You actually map the process you're doing from beginning to the end. And you're trying to find out how things go in production. And I'm talking about the reality. I'm not talking about how you think it is and so on. Get together with the group and share that view, how things actually go from code to production. It's mind-blowing how often the view is so differently by putting it somewhere on a map on a board that people can actually see, oh, that's what it does after I put it into my repository. That's how it goes. That's why you have problems. So once you have that whole value chain from business to users, and you kind of mapped it out, you will identify very easily a few bottlenecks. Like, could be deployment, could be other things, could be maybe a bunch of servers that's not performant, whatever, it doesn't really matter. If you have the value stream and you look at it as a whole delivery stream, then you will find those bottlenecks. And that's where you get started. If you have identified a bottleneck, you can start actually seeing, hey, if I do something about that bottleneck somewhere in that line, what are the benefits? I'm not talking about only the benefits in my position, in my silo, here in dev or in ops. I'm talking about what does the business and the user actually get from a bottleneck. So I can hear you thinking, hey, that's like so obvious, but I hate to repeat it, but it feels like it's like my children. I have to tell them, brush your teeth, brush your teeth, brush your teeth. And still they say, yeah, we do, and still they don't. So I can't stress this more and more, that it's so obvious, but this is actually what you should start thinking about. If you come of the world of development, your closest thing will probably be continuous delivery. You get like your code into your CI system, and then you think, oh, wouldn't it be cool if I can get that like without strings attached very easily into production? So this is where, I guess, Jess Humble with his book, Continuous Delivery, they actually made like a good description on how to tackle that area. So area one is setting the stage, finding the bottlenecks, plotting out the whole line, and then very often, and it isn't a must, but very often the first area within a DevOps journey, you will spend here in the continuous delivery, in the heart of the friction between the dev producing code and putting something live. Because what do you want to do? You want to improve reliability and the speed of delivery, which in the old days seemed like, hey, I can't go faster because then my admins will block more. So it's kind of, and then the admins were thinking, hey, we're stopping them because we're saving the company from all that crap coming into production. Still, the shared goal is how can we change our current process to make that delivery easier, to make that delivery more reliable. And so that creates actually a kind of shared problem space. In the past, continuous integration, the build master and those guys, they were somewhere in no man's land. Like, hey, we have to maintain this, but we're not the code in, but we have to talk to the admins. So what's important now for, if you start doing the continuous delivery phase, is that you have a shared problem space. Like, it's not something on your feature set, it's not something that needs to be installed on the server, it's right here in the heart that you start sharing and discussing that point. There's nothing more efficient than just two people talking about a problem space they're trying to solve. So get those people together. But it might not be your priority. These guys will probably tell you, like, we need bigger servers. And these will say, hey, we need like a new library or whatever. So align those priorities. What is it? Again, it's like, you're probably familiar with a backlog or whatever, but think of it like a mixed backlog from both sides. Where's your priority? What do you do? Very often I found the same people asking to the project team, we need more features, we need more features, were the same people negotiating service level agreements with your operations guy and say, hey, we need more stable, more stable. And they couldn't like grasp the two, that like it shouldn't, but very often change meant breaking systems. So reversing that was very important. Again, a trivial thing is, why don't you just put these people together? It's not just because you have a job title, dev or ops, that you're not allowed to sit together in one room. It's not like cats and dogs that you want to keep like out of each other to stop fighting. It's just like putting them together in the same room. And why do you do that? Because you want to minimize the effort of people talking to each other. You know, the problem we care about, the problem we want to solve is very easy if you're sitting next to me. If you're somewhere remote or even in another building, that creates a barrier. I'm not saying this is always possible, but if you can, please consider co-locating the two teams or mingling the two teams. if it's more remote, or even if you're in the same room, do some chat, wiki, mailing list that brings those people together on that first trip, like building the continuous delivery pipeline, doing that stuff together. That creates a spark of conversation. And we all know once you've done a good amount of talking to people, that you're starting to relate on a personal level, and you're starting to feel and live into the pain of somebody else. With the infrastructure as code, where I'm going to talk about like in a few talks later, there's actually now the shared code base. Like a developer can change something in the deploy scripts, can change something on the server. It's shared across the two groups. If I'm changing a config parameter or a feature, why am I currently not allowed to change anything on the monitoring system? Get that shared so we can actually work on the same system. It's not because you used to do it like that, that it used to be two separate parts, that you have to. It's very strange. The moment you put people into two groups, they think they have to act as two separate groups, but nobody's actually stopping you from talking and joining forces. Well, at least I hope not. And if they are, start questioning. Why do you want this? Why are you blocking collaboration? Why are you doing that? Infrastructure as code brought also, like the admins, they're becoming familiar with Git, virtual machines, Cucumber, testing. So again, a shared tool set, but again, a new shared language. I see people from the admins now asking the devs, Git, how does that work? How do we use that? Like classes, how does that work? So it's very interesting to get that spark at the same time, because you're passionate about code, they're passionate about servers, but if you can do it in the same language or a familiar language or concepts, that's actually very powerful as a conversation starter. So we put everything out there in the machine, share tools, and so on. Do we get people just saying you have to collaborate or communicate? Will it actually work? Well, it's kind of like the CI system. If it's broke, do you fix it? Or do you just say, hey, hands up, somebody else will fix it for me? And it's the same with something in production. If the deploy goes wrong, do you say, oh, it's the guys at the other end that will fix it or not? So question that. So most of you are developers. Are you allowed to change something in production currently? Who is allowed to do anything? 2, 3 people. So I'm not saying that you have to, but at least you should care. Like, call that guy, find out where the error is, be able to debug. That's what gets important. And if you really get to the Valhalla of continuous deployment, continuous delivery, press the button, and all the questions have been answered. It doesn't mean that it will always succeed, but at least it gets reused and you can share the same workflow. Use the same workflow for bug fixing, for whatever new features, follow that same workflow. That, the more you use your pipeline, the more reliability, the more trust you will put in it. And I mentioned infrastructure as code. If you can get like your production environment the same as your test environment, the same as your development environment, you're reusing the setups of these stuff, of these environments. So if your code goes the other way, but if you are able to detect problems as the system is in production, that creates a very important point. Stop an error the sooner in the process, because there it is, the cost is the cheapest. Once it's in production, it's a problem. But if you can push back like the reliability and the reproducibility of the environment way back to this part, that they can actually on their laptop have the same config, the same virtual machine setup, the same paths, whatever, the same database versions as you have in production, then you can create that powerful thing that they will use it every day. They will see the same problems as you're having in production. And why not share the process? It's often starts like an invite a friend, invite a friend on ops to come into your stand-ups and listen in. But at least they will be aware of things coming. They will comment, give feedback. It's that easy to make that happen. But why haven't we done that before? I don't know. Somewhere, for some reason, the Agile manifesto kind of stopped here. And I don't know. There's nothing in the manifesto that actually stops you from pulling these people also in your stand-up, also in your Scrum, getting the feedback, deciding on the backlog. And then sharing knowledge. If you have a ticketing system, what I find very often is that you have a bug fix system here for the devs based on their code, and then you have another ticketing system, which is the help desk or whatever, where you see the actual user problems come in. Like, if you create that shared thing that if you change something in your code or there is an issue, you want to know the real feedback from the world. You don't want to be like oblivious and say, hey, whatever goes out there, I'm not fixing. Because the more feedback you can get from that world, the better you can adapt your code for new things happening. Because do you really want to do that in a stressful situation, like when everything's down? Or do you want to have the feedback, at least that you can know whenever you put out a new feature that it's going to help you? So when you put things into production, it's not only the project team that actually celebrates. Like, invite the ops people at the same time, because they're often having like another 4 years that they have to run your crap. So they should, well, I hope they're celebrating, but it's like both the failures and the successes put these people together. Because if you have first put the spark of people together, then they got passionate about solving that problem. And if they're passionate about and they get success, they will have an experience history that, again, puts the trust back between the two groups. The trust that has been lost because of the old process, like we throw things over the wall and we are not communicating. And restoring that trust is actually one of the important parts. So, Area 0, putting the teams back together, see where your bottlenecks are. Area 1, continuous delivery. Like, move into that space from dev and ops. The next area is, we pushed everything to prod. But how can we learn about the things that are going on in prod? Like, how can we do that? And an important part of that is getting visibility of the things that are happening here, whether it's monitoring and metrics that you feed back. These are traditionally used in the ops world, but if you can feed it back to the project part, then you get the feedback from pushing out, feedback, pushing out, feedback. So that's an important part. So there's a new shared goal. We've pushed it out. We can push out very fast. Let's say we establish that in our continuous delivery area. The next thing is like improve uptime. How can we say we're not going to turn down or cut the application, but make sure that it keeps going and the uptime. So that's what you can learn if you put a benchmark of your monitoring and say, hey, this system is currently up for X hours or whatever, and you start improving that. That's one of the KPIs that you want to do for. And it's not code that is going to make a difference, although part of it is, but there's a new shared language. A lot of companies are adopting this as the new language, shared language, to get the feedback. It's graphs. Show me a graph what you did. It's getting more in terms of engineering. Can you prove me that the system was slow? Can you prove me that the system was actually consuming memory? Can you prove me that a new deploy actually made a difference? It's getting that science and that metrics that supports whatever view you have or whatever model you think of about the system production that you can get out of that. And there's a few systems like Graphite is one, StatsD, there's GMX integrations. So the ease of creating or very flexible putting metrics from your application to these dashboards is an important part. We're getting there in a way that it's like one line of code and bam, I have a metric, shows up on the graph. So it's becoming self-servicing for a dev to put all that in. Again, you might start with this area first as opposed to the continuous delivery. I've seen companies do it and they just say, hey, whatever we have, first we will create a benchmark of our metrics and our monitoring. And then that's gonna allow us to see where our bottlenecks are. And then we have our bottleneck, we can start improving, and then we do the continuous delivery. It's not a way. I've talked about monitoring metrics, but there's more. All the production logs, the errors, the core dumps, whatever you can think about that, like get access, get the devs the feedback from what's happening in production so they can see what people are actually using or experiencing as a problem. At Atlassian, we're running about like 45,000 JVMs, and out of memory is one of our biggest problems. So we created a system that would like dump all the out of memory dumps in one system, available for the devs to look at. Like, and we're now experimenting with ways to order, like in what part of the code does it happen more often? So we can prioritize and give the feedback to our developers what are the most important parts that they should be fixing in their code. So getting that feedback out is very important. Again, what gets interesting is that there's a crossover between testing and monitoring. Like you can reuse maybe your functional tests, integration tests, and turn them into monitoring. So you see there's a small relationship between the two of them. I've seen this happen, this transformation happen so many times. It's like when you have the metrics and the monitoring going, put your wall full of displays where they're shown. It's a simple trick, but it creates the magic that you're drinking coffee and you're looking at that graph and it goes red. I was like, why is that red? Conversation starter. Your CDO comes in and it's like, why are these lines now all of a sudden like going like this? Explain me. So getting that feedback, understanding, it's a simple trick. Put it out there in the hallway near the coffee machine that people can start discussing. And I kind of guarantee you that it's gonna drive changes where you wanna have them. It's very powerful. Because you will see a few levels of this view. Of course, the devs care about maybe their application metrics, these guys, about like CPU, memory, network usage. But what's getting interesting is that we can provide the system or the business with the actual metrics. So if they see an increase in sale or a decrease in sale, can we relate that to a change in the code? Can we relate that to us putting in an operating system patch or not? So it's kind of linking these metrics together. And once you start exposing it, it's like a drug. The more you want to see, the more you want to explore. And therefore, it's very important that when you put up that system, is that it's kind of self-servicing for everybody to look at the graph. So no passwords or whatever, put it there in the open, allow people to put their own metrics in, like in their code. If they want to have something measured, that it should be very easy to measure. And it's interesting because test-driven development, it kind of stops here. So maybe we can get somewhere to monitoring-driven development and see if we have a metric or a check we first put up. And we actually see if we put it out in our test system as well, on our development system, whether it's actually bringing the value that we want it to have, whether it goes green. It's a different mindset from code complete to actually something running with the functionality, it's interesting. If things fail here in production, very often it stays in this silo about people discussing it. System Java goes out of memory. What do? We simply restart it. Okay, if it restarts 5 times, we increase the heap. Well, it shouldn't go like that. It should actually go to why is this happening? How often is this happening? And can we get the feedback here so it actually gets fixed at the root cause? So again, exposing that information allows people to look at it. But in the process, when there's like a huge failure that broke things, get these people here as well so they can hear and listen in on the things that were failing. So there's a better chance of fixing things at the root cause. At a certain point, it becomes more important how fast you can react to a problem as opposed to how fast can you detect it. Well, not detect, but the reliability, things break. We take that for granted. We used to go the road about like multi-cluster, high availability, whatever systems. More and more, we're scaling it out to horizontal systems. And we know, like, if one breaks, sure. But how fast can we put it into a state that it's like, okay again? Like, maybe 2 of my web servers can go down if I have 7 in total. So the fact that you can respond and say, hey, I have this capacity of putting them back online, how fast can I do that is becoming important. And it's becoming less important like the individual component availability, if I can play with that. Area 0, get it going. Area 1, continuous delivery, go that direction for you guys. Monitoring metrics, get the feedback. But you see, it kind of stays here in that area. Very often, this part will be tool-centric, getting some people involved. You can work quite a bit on the process flow, so tools, process, and obviously getting the people together and getting them to collaborate is important. But the tools are more predominantly in that section. So what we really want is to completely embed the project into this phase. It's not somewhere at the handover what we now just optimized for automation and kind of that. It's like embedding all project knowledge that we had immediately into operations. Developers on call. Doesn't that sound strange? But more and more companies are actually doing this. If you put like a new system live, you're gonna stay for a couple of months responsible for every call in production. Guess what happened? Documentation got way improved. Hey, they got responsibility. They will respond if something goes wrong and not say, hey, I'm not on call me tomorrow, find a fix that will fix it for you. Side effect might be that you need root access to also do whatever you need. But again, the root access, you shouldn't actually need. I keep telling to my colleagues that eventually I don't even want to know the root password of my systems. If my pipeline can take whatever change I have through that system, I don't need to log into that system. As somebody told me, logging into a server is a harmful thing. Why do we need that? I'm going to tell you why you need it. If something did break and you would do an analysis, you might want to gather information about that system that happened. Still, you have to reflect if something went wrong and you needed to log into that server manually. Think about how can we expose that information so you don't need the root access, maybe the log files or whatever. Can we expose it through a service or a central system that people can just access it? So reducing the access here that you need is actually another driving way of saying, hey, can we get all the information? Is everything exposed? And some of you might have heard about something called NoOps, which is a term that at Netflix they use. It's kind of like the devs push, the system automatically puts it here, and I don't even know ops. There's a debate about like people saying, oh, it's a bad term, and I agree, because it says you don't need ops anymore. No, that's not true. It just means like, hey, it automatically goes down, and if the system somewhere in between fails, then the dev gets feedback, so on. But what do these people bring in? They have experience with backups, monitoring, all that stuff that you're not used to, operating system things, network. So it's not that you throw away all that knowledge, although people might think, hey, I'm a dev, I can code, infrastructure as code, I can take over. But the funny thing is they have to go through the same learning experience as these guys have been all their life about how reliable, how to put things into production. So you can call it NoOps, but it's actually a kind of collapsed team that is working on the two. I've told you about that before. Instead of creating the ad hoc monitoring here, why not conceive it from the beginning? Metrics-driven development. If you can do something, you get a metric for your feature, you put it in. So the difference here is between these parts, it was more like, hey, I feed some information. If I can get from here, I'm at the beginning of the project. I'm at the conception of the project, where I can actually change something at the core instead of just being friendly and say, you can, it's interesting, you might. And for this, this is becoming shared rules. Like, if something failed along the line, then it doesn't go through, period. It's not that I'm going to push it through from the project because I have to deliver my deadline and they're important, whatever. It's just a shared rule of saying, I'm going to hand you back when it failed. But you already got into continuous delivery, so your speed is already okay, but it's important that you now stop and take the time when something fails and you don't push it through to production. And what's also interesting, by putting the devs here, these people very often get a better view on the business. When I was working as an admin, I would see servers and CPU and memory, but I have no clue what that software that I was running was doing. If a user called me and said, I have a problem in my menu and I have to click through, I wouldn't know. But the devs know because they were at the conception of creating those functionalities, so they would bring the ops people and show, hey, this is how you log in. This is the most important feature for a user. If you can do this, that's important. So you're kind of fusing that information from a dev to an ops people just by putting it in the team from a daily operations point. And there's obviously the return. The devs can learn a lot from operations as well. Who has heard about Chaos Monkey? A few. So instead of having things break only in production, the guys from Netflix had the beautiful idea. Why can't we just put randomly killed servers in our test environment while it's running? Or even maybe in your development environment, why don't we destroy your instance every day and see if you can reproduce it? It's cool. By design, by doing that, you're experiencing the same problems, but more often, and you can get trained and they will be exposed faster as you normally have to wait in ops. So it's an interesting idea, but it does require obviously an architecture that can support it. You don't want to do destroy your cluster or something. But there's a few things it has built in. What I will tell you is stop the languages bloat. oh, cool, MongoDB knows whatever flavor du jour you're having here. Try to keep it like in the same state, because you can't support like every time a new concept or a new language or new, if you have to support it, you're trying to minimize and pushing it to a standard. And I've been to companies where it's been taken to the extreme, but like we standardize on one product and that product has to do everything. So I'm not talking about that thing, but look hard about a functionality you can do in the same language, if not only for hiring people or making sure that like you have expertise. Let's say you have Python, Ruby, Scala, whatever. It's hard. You guys might be doing it daily, but these guys just, yeah, they don't know the language. For them, it's another tool. They have to switch every time to support. So if you can compress the number of tools used, that's actually going to make a difference. Another term you might be searching for is rugged DevOps. What it actually does is it has concepts that will change the architecture of your application, so it becomes like more resilient or fail-safe or has open failure or closed failure, like whatever you decide that it's actually doing. So it's just a term I put there for people Googling. There's a lot of interest from people into this of the security field to actually collaborate with DevOps people. And why is that? Because they used to be telling you all have to patch, and they have this like huge vulnerability list that nobody changed. Now with continuous delivery and doing smaller changes and getting the feedback of things that happened, those guys are actually looking for an ally because they can drive change what's important. They can close vulnerabilities faster. They can push it through the automation. They can put the testing on. I know there's still a worry about them because they used to be like the gates here, like QA, security, change advisory board. So they have to reframe themselves in a way that a lot of the changes that we used to do that they have to approve will become standard changes, and then we will move on to the more dangerous changes or like database schema changes. That's still scary. Like upgrading a web server, that's fine, but if database schema is shared across a lot of application servers, you have to make sure that that keeps on working. But still, it's the mentality that you can become more secure by doing more changes, where in the past it was like, stop doing changes because that actually drives down the security. So you actually are designing now for operations. It's funny, we had a tool that we needed to automatically install, and we got the product, and the only way we could automate that was going through the browser and filling in form details. Really? I want to have some silent install file. I want to have a way to specify the parameters of a setup and not starting a curl through to actually fill something in your browser. So this is just an example of how can you design for operations in your application. And that makes a difference once you start doing changes more often or things at scale. You will actually see that depending on what type of company you are, if you have only one product going over, that's fine. But if you have multiple products, you will see that the approach for all these projects will not be that different. So you can probably reuse parts of the metrics. You can probably reuse parts of the OS like you would use for your frameworks. And that creates a kind of reusable component, or what you call a blueprint, across your different applications. And of course, we want to have that speed. Like whenever something happens here, get it immediately changed into the core and not being stuck somewhere here. And what's interesting is that we actually want to change the flow. So very often, there is this tendency about pushing new features to production, where if you reverse it and say, hey, we're going to pull when we're ready, or when it passes the tests, it gets you in a different mindset. Just pulling in changes. It changes the pressure to the system instead of you wanting to push out like things as fast as possible. I'm saying this is very related to Kanban or the way you set it up, is that operations can actually pull something to production when it's finished. And that's, I know it's a kind of generic slide, but the waste is just, the cron job that restarts your server every night because you have a memory leak, really, it's a simple technical debt, but just push that down, fix that. Don't keep it there forever. Put it somewhere on the backlog, make sure that it's understood, or maybe get taken in the next release. And I've talked about it before, it's the functional versus the non-functional requirements to actually make that balance. And it's not easy. Like, you have to cut it down to smaller pieces and say, hey, this will increase our uptime. But if you're only going for features and pushing out new features to production, you're going to build up a lot of problems in the future by avoiding upgrades, avoiding putting things as logging into that. You can also drill people with failures, like fire drills. Just put them together. Every 2 weeks, we're going to pull wires in the production room and see what happens, how you have to respond. Train that, get that muscle memory about how to react in case of failure. And if you're doing that together, it's actually restoring trust. And I think trust is still the key word that we kind of lost over the last years between the two groups. So get them together, get something in the area that you want to improve, get the feedback, and then make sure it's at the beginning of the project and everything from the end of the project actually gets installed. And it's not like my precious people like the one in The Lord of the Rings. It's actually the fact that these people are collaborating is becoming important. The silo managers, it's not because you have two groups or you used to have two groups that these managers have to stay separately. Just by giving them the same job title and saying, hey, I have to work together and we're co-responsible, drives it differently. It might scare people that they're kind of, they don't have their own turf that they can control, but still, this is the kind of change you have to drive. Because you're actually going for that shared culture. And it's the shared mental assumption that by collaborating and looking at the end goal and not looking at my personal goal or looking at the goal of just putting out features or operations, that's where you want to go for. So DevOps is actually about making these things overlap. It's not that some people have a DevOps group, which is great as a conversation starter, but eventually has to move out in this overlapped area as a cross-functional team, having people work together, but not only in your project, but also in your actually production. And you want to go beyond your dev and the ops, because it doesn't stop there. Dev and ops was just by accident that I use those terms, but there's way more. If your bonus system is not aligned with like your systems or the things you do, you're going to have a problem. I used to work in a company that had a person had a bonus if they can just keep the VMware up. What does that tell you? He did a great job, but he was actually saying no all the time to people because that was the best way for him to get his bonus. So just making sure that these things are also aligned makes it important. Or in finance, like the budget goes to the project and then it's only a fraction goes to operations. Really just rethink that balance if you're thinking about the whole stuff. The other part might also be true. does operations need their own budget? Because then they'll start buying bigger servers, and every year there's going to be a bigger budget. And why? Question that. Like, put those budgets in one pool and get your priorities straight across the two lines. Or you want to, I told before, sometimes you might be working on different parts of the project. And Jess Humble also wrote about it. Like, companies are starting to evolve into a networked way of kind of small startups within their own company that they kind of create the synergy. So if you're reusing the same workflow, if you're reusing the same tools, they have total control over their own view and flexibility, but still they can create like a synergy between the two groups. And if you want to take it outside your company, why don't you share with the industry the things you do, or the community? It's so important. More and more we're using community parts. Why don't we just contribute back? DevOps kind of got started by accident. And 3 years after the word got started, this happened. Somebody tried to register trademark it, which was for me really scary. But luckily, thanks to all the people sharing their stories, sharing what they thought it would be, this is what actually happened. So the people in the US, the authorities, turned it down, and the evidence for turning it down was the fact that people shared so much on the internet about it, so nobody could claim the actual term. So I think that's pretty powerful. DevOps wasn't started by a company, it was just started by people getting together, sharing the ideas. Twitter was a very important thing. I run the DevOps days as well. It's just sharing that part. Share is crucial. If you want to know more, I'm working together with a couple of other authors. We're not going to gain money on that, but we felt after 3 years, things like the areas and the practices we see people doing, that we're trying to bundle that in a book, because a lot of it, sharing is great, but it's very often fragmented, so we're trying to consolidate that in one book. So thank you all for being here, and thanks for sharing.